folks. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this sunny yet slightly tepid Monday morning. It is my pleasure to welcome Danielle Jung here today. Danielle is an assistant professor of political science at Emory. She is one of our Pelio speakers that is coming in around our topics of non-state actor governance in ungoverned spaces. Her work focuses on the study of legitimacy and governance in areas of fragile or emerging states. And she uses agent-based modeling to study how social organizations organize, as well as when, how, and why these organizations provide services. In particular, she does work with things like rebel groups or the project she's going to be presenting today, which deals with gang governance. Her newest project is focusing on these issues in Haiti around the emergence, functioning, and impact of criminal gangs. So without further ado, let me turn it over. I will be keeping the queue up here, so just kind of wave to me if you want to be in line.
So first, thanks. This comes at a really, I think, helpful window in this project to incorporate feedback, so we're really anxious to get that. So this work is all joint with Derek Cohen, and to give you kind of some background, this really started out as, Sam mentioned, as work that was primarily focused on these criminal gangs and thinking about how they are similar to what we know about rebel governance and how they might be different. And part of the work kind of involved in doing this was getting data on fatalities in Haiti. And in doing that, what emerged is that this kind of community justice or lynchings were a tremendous part of this story that we weren't expecting, and we really wanted to think about carefully and how that played into these issues of governance. So we were fascinated by the emergence of this practice, not just in Haiti, but in many other places, and also the stability of this practice was fairly surprising to us. So this is early work. It's what I sent is kind of an odd format because our current plan is to tackle kind of two questions in one of those shorter book formats. So you're getting kind of the proto version of some of that. So it's not a traditional kind of paper style right now. So there are kind of 2 points we want to emphasize, or 2 questions we're working through right now. I think there are many others related to this topic. So the first is the emergence as kind of a lack of legitimacy, either kind of gang or state. And then also thinking through how this is sustained and legitimized by the kind of brutal mechanisms that require kind of popular and mass participation, and the role of that. So this is, I think, an understudied form of political violence, but my sense is it's not necessarily understudied in other disciplines, so I think it's really helpful for us to have kind of an interdisciplinary audience who can point us to other literatures or other cases that we might be able to kind of fruitfully link to. We're also planning on going back and doing some qualitative work in Haiti. So any suggestions around kind of critical ideas to tie in would be very helpful and welcome. And as would examples of either this institution or parallel ones kind of moving away from this and reestablishing kind of state legitimacy are all things like issues that we're really wrestling with right now as we move forward. So that's, I think, my 5 minutes. So.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I was really fascinated to read this because we talk a lot about governance in areas that lack governance, but I don't know that we always talk about the really seedy and negative underbellies of what can happen when you do have a failure of governance, right, or that space with lack of governance and legitimacy. I will open it up to the floor. Lee, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I think it's a great topic. I'm coming at it from economic history, and you mentioned Terry Anderson and P.J. Hill's work about vigilante groups, and I think in the beginning you sort of build a framework, a theoretical framework to look at this, and you talk about a weak state leads to these emergence of community justice. And I think that's true if we think about the frontier West, so Anderson and Hill's work fits. But you also mentioned lynchings in the U.S. South, and where, in the late 1890s, a black man was lynched every third day, publicly murdered, so to speak. So it was a real deal. But it was condoned by the state. So I wouldn't say the state was weak. The state allowed, encouraged, condoned this. So it's sort of a different, they wanted these groups to do what they couldn't do, in a way. So it wasn't out of their weakness, or maybe it was, but I'm not sure how because you mentioned the lynching thing, and then the reason to follow it through is the federal government finally played a heavier hand, but so did social norms in the South to get rid of lynching. So what you could follow is the emergence after the Civil War of so-called community justice, particularly after Reconstruction in 1873. Then its zenith in the 1890s, and then its decay into the 1920s, and then we got rid of it essentially. So I find that interaction between the state, where you take you're pretty strong in the beginning that it arises because of a weak state, and it could be a weak de facto state, but not de jure.
Right. I think that kind of the role of where this fits in is something we're wrestling with, right? So is it kind of is it going from nothing, right, and the establishment of the state, or is it kind of the state has weakened or withdrawn and then resurges? And I'm not really sure if those are different processes. It feels like they might be. But I think there's something about when there is the option of, there is like a de jure option, right? But this, but they choose the different path, I think is very interesting, right? When there are potentially two tracks that are, yes, and I think, I'm not sure if that's a different situation than more of the Anderson and Hill style.
Well, I think it's different. It's different from the Anderson and Hill one because there wasn't any government.
Right.
So that's one way I define a frontier, sort of the absence of government. But the U.S. South was very different. So it was almost as if they delegated it to a community, to the Klan and others. But it wasn't uniform. Then within that, plantation owners protected their workers who weren't going to get lynched because they're way more powerful than these Klan guys. So you had this hierarchy. So you had I would say, de facto absence of the state, but it's almost as if they chose not to participate in this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Susie?
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I was thinking about it from the Philippines case, where, so by happenstance, I don't do research on this kind of topic, but by happenstance, I happened to read a working paper by Thomas Zaitzoff about vigilante justice in Western Mexico. And they brought up some really interesting cases like the Philippines case where there's this delegation thing happening where some of the government's weak or illegitimate, but the type of accountability mechanism is viewed as illegitimate, like that kind of harsh punishment's illegitimate. So they have to outsource that to these death squads, these vigilante death squads. And they got a lot of support from voters in the Philippines. So this was an interesting case where it seems like you can have a legitimate government, but also have these high levels of vigilante violence. So I was thinking, like, a theoretical solution to getting around this is not to sidestep the honor killing stuff and the lynchings, but treat all of these empirical phenomena as, examples of community justice or vigilante justice, but they have different causes. And you're looking at one potential cause, which is a weak state or an illegitimate state. And that might be able to explain some of these forms of community justice. But there might be other ones that can be better explained by other theories. Like the lynchings might be able to explain by something else. Like the social deviance sort of theory where, people are punished for, deviating from social norms, and the government just delegates that job to the local, to private forms of governance. And then you're looking at, a specific type of community justice that isn't even generated by extreme forms of violence. Like, these are people who are like harshly punishing petty theft. So it doesn't even fit the Philippines case where people are, wanting a harsher government response. So it's a really interesting case. And I think you can have a better justification for your case method, or your case selection, where you're choosing this case because it isolates all of those other alternative explanations. Those other theories don't apply to this Haitian case. And that helps you that allows you to be able to look at the microdynamics of what happens when there's a weak state, and is it really weak state versus illegitimate state, and how those two things kind of play out in reality. I think that would be maybe a better way, because I'm worried that reviewers aren't going to allow you to get away with just sort of saying honor killings are different from what we're looking at, so we're just going to ignore that.
Yeah, I like that idea of trying to build something that is at least theoretically inclusive of that. I mean, as another way to say that they're socially illegitimate, right? That if we think about cases of social deviance as not being within, right, if it's not legal kind of legitimacy of the state, there's like some kind of social legitimacy, and that might be a way to fold in this idea of the American South as well. Just to flag something else, we're working through what to call this, right? So in Haiti, it's called lynching, but obviously that comes with kind of a lot of kind of cognitive baggage for us. So we're really working through what the right term is, right? And that may depend on how broad we want to kind of capture this or how broadly.
I wanted to focus on the fundamental conceptualization of legitimacy. You speak of it as though it was some kind of a separate category that exists out there that's kind of self-evident when it's present and when it isn't. And I would submit that legitimacy is a sociological phenomenon. It exists in the minds, fundamentally a phenomenological phenomenon. It exists in the minds of the citizens themselves. And to the extent that the state ventures too far away from this sort of fundamental value structure of society, where the state's policies, actions, its presence in their lives deviates from what they anticipate and expect, that there will form gaps that will need to be filled somehow. I'm thinking here that in this sense, legitimacy is fundamentally divisible. That if it weren't, then the Ostrom's work on polyarchical governance would be a sham. It would be something that couldn't possibly happen. I'm thinking here that you might benefit from taking a look at some of Jürgen Habermas's work over the years on legitimacy, and it's starting from the fundamental question of if the law legitimates state action, in the absence of law, what legitimates state action, and second question, and more importantly, what legitimates the law? So why would it be that individual citizens would look to the state to provide this kind of justice when they can find it right to hand, in their local, whatever the enforcement mechanism is, in that? And I think this also begins to strike out the serious differences between John Rawls and Robert Nozick and their separate writings about this and the origin of order within the state. I like what you're doing here because it really strikes to the fundamental question: what is government? Even more, and that's a more profound and basic question, I think, than the ones you're asking, which are actually pretty profound and basic, but this one even more basic. And so I think rounding that out by maybe nodding in the direction of some of the other traditions in the literature and showing how yours is different from theirs might be a way to overcome what some people might see as being a sort of a gap in your approach. I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm hoping that some of these comments will be helpful.
They are very helpful. The short answer is that feels like it deserves a very big, crisp answer, and I'm not going to be able to give that. I think what what was really striking about this is that there shouldn't, the idea that there are potentially multiple entities that could put someone to death, or there isn't a system that would put someone to death for a fairly minor crime, when there is, in theory, a state, was striking and puzzling. And I think you're right, like working through some of these, the issues from normative theory about the origins of who gives, where does authority come from, right? Could be a really fruitful way to do that. But this idea that it's very common to put for neighbors to put someone to death for often pickpocketing or a pretty minor crime was just like shocking, or really puzzling to work through, particularly if there is kind of maybe it's less Haiti's a somewhat distinct case, but in the case of the American South, right, where there are other mechanisms at work.
So I wasn't sure if you mentioned here, just to follow up, I wasn't sure if you mentioned here the idea of the rule of law here, because, there's nothing to say that in the absence of some legitimate police force, and perhaps the rule of law, that society doesn't just become stupid and begin to take, justice takes on these more extreme aspects.
So, I don't think there's an easy answer there. What I can say is, it does seem like the role of the police and the availability of the police is interesting, right? So in the cases in the South, a lot of kind of the members of who did some of the lynchings were police officers by day, right? In some of the examples in Haiti, right, either the police are present or at least seem to be nearby, right? And so I think that's another kind of tricky aspect of this, right? Is it just that they're extremely weak and can't do anything, or is it that it's actually murkier, that they're imbuing this with not just some kind of community sanction, but kind of some kind of tacit, right, overreach with the state, right?
We can talk more about this over lunch. I have some ideas.
Okay.
Barb?
Yes, some of the prior comments have covered some of what I wanted to say, so let me phrase it this way. I too was finding that the term legitimacy, that varies with the perspective. From whose perspective is something legitimate or not? And so, from Lee's earlier point about what happened in the South, you almost have to look at it from a systems perspective. Why would the police delegate to, let's say, the Klan? It's because to maintain one form of legitimacy, the police don't do it themselves directly because they need to have their relationship still, they have to worry about where their relationship is with the rest of the government or the federal government. So they can de facto delegate to another group who now, from the police, have been legitimized to exercise this power. But what underlies all of that? Well, maybe economic power. You want certain groups to remain subjected relative to others. So it's almost like you need to lose, it seems to me, legitimacy as a relative term from whose frame of reference. Because some forms, as explained others, some forms of this kind of violent treatment can actually be a manifestation, like you said, it was tacit, like it's agreed. It's like a tacit agreement that you can do this. It's been legitimized by the other dimensions in play. And sometimes what happens is they have certain parties to maintain their legitimacy in one venue. they present a pretense of legitimacy and then authorize people to behave contrary in another sense. So, like even thinking about in the South with when you have gerrymandered legislatures, they get legitimized by actually winning certain elections. But then how do they exercise that power in various settings in a way that some might perceive as not really totally legitimate with all the rules? I mean, it's very much relative to, I would suggest a systems perspective. From whose perspective is this considered legitimate or not legitimate, so you get better into the motivations. Because here's one last thing that I'll mention, and I know this will sound a little out there, but I actually think Scott Peck's book, M. Scott Peck is a psychiatrist who also talked about systems, from systems perspective. He's got a book called People of the Lie. And it's his way of trying to explain evil and how certain kinds of dynamics take form when you have a malignant form of narcissism. So that the party exercising the narcissism cannot tolerate the evidence that comes of what their true behavior is. So they lash out and try and destroy the evidence of it. That's a whole nother dynamic. This is where somebody's asserting power in such a way that the reality of what's coming in is such a narcissistic injury. They can't tolerate the criticism. They act out and lash out. You have systems that you can have that behavior not just by individuals, but now systems themselves can operate like on a system level of narcissism. And what happens is that you can have people acting out and delegating things certain ways where you have all sorts of like pretense. I'm going to claim I'm doing such and such, so they say one thing, and then over here they have another group doing something else. That's a whole other dynamic. That's not the absence of, like getting to Lisa, that's not necessarily the absence of some kind of state. That's how it's been manipulated. I don't know how else to explain it, but it's more than just the absence of, and this is where I thought Peck's book was so helpful to say that sometimes you've got a whole other dynamic that's taking play, where there's an affirmative lashing out and distinguishing, and there's actually an attempt to exercise power in a much more manipulative way. And so then come with the other comments. So maybe some forms of the community justice you're looking at, maybe some forms of it are arising from the lack of some power, and other forms are actually the exercise of it. But in a nested kind of system where to maintain legitimacy at different levels, you have the pretense of being legitimate at one level, and then you de facto allow something to help out at another level. And that's not out of weakness. It's because, man, that's what I really want to happen. But you're trying to finesse legitimacy at multiple levels. So that's, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on. But that's why legitimacy is a relative term.
Okay.
It seems to me that you just start going down that road somehow, and that's where I was trying to pick up the other comments.
So then maybe one would be kind of certain social ills would be threatening to one of those levels.
Yeah, like the state police, they may not want to do something overtly directly because they're trying to maintain a certain air of legitimacy with the federal government, just taking our country for example. So they don't do it overtly, but then they authorize or essentially legitimize other people to act de facto, to the point where some of the members of the Klan themselves were police officers. But they just don't exercise the act wearing their police uniform.
Right.
They do it in another setting. And why does that maintain? Because there's legitimacy, at least in the white community, there was legitimacy to in fact invoke that kind of balance in a racial context. So now it became legitimized at that level. So you've got nested layers of systems where you have to define what legitimacy is relative to them. So it may be that the state, some parts of the state, are actually permitting it. And it's actually an exercise of power, just with more pretense or pretext of what they're doing. It's not out of weakness. It's actually out of strength. And then when the people who are most adversely affected try to fight back, the state will not respond to them, but not out of weakness. It's because that's the outcome we want in the first place.
Or military does that.
And that's a whole other dynamic that So you'd have to be clear that you're not talking about that.
Yeah.
And that's why I was trying in my own way. I found that what the other commenters were saying was resonating. So it's just another way of trying to. But actually understand overt. That's why I kept referring to textbook, because he wrote this a couple of decades ago, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen it manifest. It's understanding that this is this is not by accident. This is pretextual. And there's a certain dynamic in play, and it can happen at the individual level, and can also happen to become pathological and happen in systems. Where it's an overt lashing out. It's a certain way of exercising power. Sorry about that.
Do you want to respond? Should we keep going?
No, I mean, I haven't thought about it in the systemic way. One thing, I mean, I love kind of your reaction. Would it be helpful for us to separate kind of procedural or input legitimacy, right, from performance or output legitimacy? Would that be at all helpful to kind of spell out, like, what are the processes versus what is actually the outcome, right?
I would suggest not just the processes, but what was the purpose of the processes,
Okay.
of their functionality. Because sometimes the processes are there, they were established for a certain function, but they're being abused.
Okay.
So one form of illegitimacy is that they are technically following the processes, but when you look at what's intent was, it becomes abusive. This gets relative, but this is part of the problem we're talking about with gerrymandering and things like that. They're technically following certain rules to get in power, but then as they're exercising that power, at what point now at committee hearings or these other kinds of things are they abusing processes? And now you've got another level of legitimacy. Okay, well, what are we referring to now? Some other kinds of social values of fairness. I mean, that's why I think you almost have to look at a systems level. You have to be very clear which rules and processes, and from what systems perspective was the purpose or function of them. So you can actually say there's a difference between a quote-unquote legitimate use of it and an illegitimate use of it. Is this making any sense?
Okay.
Is that, at least that's how I'm seeing it.
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating project. I come from an angle of the Kurdish dispute in Turkey. In Turkish case, there is a perception among Kurds living in the southeast that state has monopoly over violence, and state achieves that, by deploying military vehicles in big cities and transferring the monopoly of power to paramilitary groups in rural areas. And some of these paramilitary groups exercise kind of brutal violence that you described in your paper. But actually citizens in those cases still consider them as part of the state and view and acknowledge that state has monopoly over violence. Yet citizens also acknowledge that the state is unable to perform its services, such as protecting the rights of vulnerability communities, women, or the citizens are not likely to go to Turkish courts for resolving their disputes. Kurdish citizens, citizens with Kurdish background. So this makes me think that there might be, state strength perhaps can be conceptualized in two categories, whether it has monopoly of violence or not, on one dimension, and on the other dimension, whether it can provide services or not. And these two dimensions breed different notions of legitimacy in the minds of citizens. In some cases, citizens might consider state as legitimate, even though they may not necessarily support it, and vice versa. So, thanks.
So can I just ask more about where these paramilitary groups that are dispatched, so they actually punish in this way, in the same?
So
Or
basically, in rural areas, there are institutions called village guards. These constitute of mainly Turkish communists coming from Turkic origin, and state gives them weapons and right to punish PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party army members. And these individuals are known to engage in violent acts in the past, such as asking for tax from other villages, or kidnapping common. But the community knows that these individuals are tied to the state, so they are not accountable in a sense, and this, I think, further leads to erosion of trust in state in Turkish context. But there is, I think, a linkage in terms of these different dynamics that you could also emphasize in your. I don't know if Heidi might be a totally different case, but
I mean, the village guards are seen as like a paramilitary organization, right?
yeah.
Because I mean, they are directly funded by the Turkish state, right? It's a government-appointed position.
Yes, they are funded by the state.
So your concern is just that they engage in behaviors that are not officially sanctioned by the state under the mandate of the village guard.
Yes, so, but even if state recognizes their misbehavior, they go unpunished. And this rolls into larger disputes in the area, but legitimacy often goes unquestioned. So.
yeah, I mean something that we didn't include in this draft, but might be kind of fruitful to put on the table, is we did a little survey experiment where we kind of primed people on, you know, should who should be providing these services, right? Whether it's just kind of local groups and community groups, or should agents in the state, right? Should your local government be providing it? And even in areas where the gangs are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of kind of roads and sewage and water issues, there is kind of this like sense that the state should be doing this stuff, that we should be able to expect the state to be doing this, right? Which is something that I think could be interpreted a bunch of ways, but I think speaks to this point of like, the murkiness of where this line is, right? But that psychologically, even people who, or populations that don't have a lot of good experiences with the state doing what we think, you know, a well-functioning state should be producing, still have this sense that that is their job, right? And that they're failing, but they would prefer to get kind of governance from one single entity, and they have a preference over that being the state. So that's doesn't speak directly to this, but I think gets at some of these kind of interesting dynamics of kind of where these groups may be delegated authority or not, that you're raising, that are fascinating.
Dean is next in the queue, but Lee, was your point directly to this?
Well, no, I'll come back to
Okay, Dean, let me begin.
Yeah, I think I want to point out a couple things I think might tie some of these things together. I found it hard to know not only what state legitimacy was, but what community justice was. And I think you kind of owe it to define it fairly carefully. And your hypotheses are sort of hypotheses about correlations, which is unusual. And so it's hard to figure out who's making the decisions, what are people taking as parameters. And so all these stories of lynching in the South and all these other things that Margaret mentioned and Bob mentioned, it's just not clear, what's being decided here, when to organize, to take some action. Is it justice if it's lynching? Is it not justice? Is it mafia? Where does the mafia fit in? Neighborhood watch? It's just really hard to tell. Is it's just not clear what the hypotheses are or what is driving them. And then to think about how to interpret the data, you're just not clear what to make of it, except there are some lynchings. I mean, I think there's some structure here. Maybe you have some in mind that you can elaborate.
So I think it's fair to push on kind of clearly specifying state legitimacy in general, and kind of community justice. I think the hypotheses, for better or for worse, and we'll probably sharpen them, I'm sure we will sharpen them as we go forward, but we're not at this point trying to make a crisp causal story, and I frankly don't think we have the data to do that right now. So I don't want to kind of pretend that we do. But what we're looking for really is what would be evidence of kind of falling into this kind of gray area where no one has a monopoly on legitimacy, and does that seem to be kind of the space where these justice practices seem to emerge? And I think, we do have initial kind of suggestive evidence that that's true. I am not frankly sure what to do about this issue of how organized and versus how spontaneous this justice is. So, and I think part of this is how general do we want to be, where it probably is more kind of organized in certain settings and more spontaneous in others. And Haiti is, for better or for worse, we see evidence of both, right? So they have these kind of like souped up neighborhood watch organizations that clearly sometimes kind of lead the charge and are a focal point around these incidents. But other times it appears that it is fairly spontaneous, right? And it happens pretty much on the spot, which leads me to think that they're not always involved. And I don't know. I would like to be able to kind of think about the phenomenon more broadly rather than I think it's going to be hard to isolate the cases where it's super organized. But I'm frankly like struggling with how to fit that in. It feels important to talk about how there is sometimes some organization that's taking place, and maybe that's going to be part of this story and part of kind of how the state kind of builds itself to, or these organizations kind of react. But part of it feels like it is fairly just it happens in the market and it's taken care of in the market just very quickly. So that's a long way to say I agree with you, but I think there are, and I'm not sure how broad or how narrow to kind of trim this piece right now.
I enjoyed reading this. Last week we were talking about quantum theory here in this room, so I'm so excited to be talking about this subject today. Although it was great to stretch my brain, try to stretch my brain around quantum theory, go back to politics today. But still really, really difficult questions. I liked a lot how you pointed out that in Haiti and rural areas we don't see this sort of justice phenomenon arising.
No,
I think you said that you do? Oh.
No, I thought so.
Okay, then I misread it. But I think that thinking about spatial differentiation or other forms of differentiation, how citizens experience weak or legitimate states, I think that this project is an interesting way to do that. And I'm thinking also about my own research where definitely I didn't see this sort of thing emerging in areas of weak state presence in rural West African Sahel, and thinking about how in this context I saw some state presence, some NGO presence, some presence of traditional leadership structures, more co-production going on in how citizens receive services and how citizens organize to solve problems in their community, and not necessarily
around issues of crime and punishment, but that we don't always see in these areas of weak state presence phenomena like this arising and thinking about the conditions that differentiate that. I think that this is very interesting.
So one of the things that was striking to me, but I think Dara's work really focuses on kind of gendered violence, is that, and this may get to some of the earlier questions, like, this doesn't seem to, this isn't exclusively, or almost exclusively, kind of men are the targets of this type of violence. And one of the explanations that we talk about is that women are often killed in the same way. It's just kind of associated with sorcery or witchcraft, right? And that may get, I mean, it's an interesting thing that we're trying to work through, kind of how that plays out there. But it's a striking pattern when we look at kind of these differentiations and who and how and which citizens experience this differently.
But it's an interesting question, right? So the cases that you have where there's weak state presence but there isn't community justice, right? These global places. So what's going on there that doesn't allow it to arise, whether it's conflict context or something like that. So, Lee, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is in the sense of you saying you wanted maybe a book project. I think you have two different things going on. So if you think about the state, thinking about Bob's comment about the rule of law, you've got laws made by a recognized authority who chooses whether or not to enforce those laws. I'm sure Haiti has laws that would protect property, for example. So if somebody breaks into your house, you call the police. In principle, the police investigates, they do acts, okay. But what's interesting here is you've got what I consider not an institutional response, but a behavioral norm response. So you have behavior predicated by, based on the beliefs of a significant subset of the population about what's right to do under certain circumstances. And why that's important is it's not a rule. It's this belief that we know when we should act, whether it's a lynching or you hack somebody. And what I found interesting about this phenomenon is that this is group behavior. It isn't one guy shooting the guy. It's people, and it's got a demonstration effect. The same with the South. There was a demonstration effect. You tie somebody up and you lynch them, and people would come and watch you. So it's supposed to have this performance impact on the rest of society. I mean, I've been trying to understand this difference between norms and what we think about as institutions. And I think that the fundamental difference is it's behavior by a large group that's not orchestrated by a recognized authority. And so it'd really be fascinating, to the extent you can, to figure out the origins. Because right now, your tests and things, your correlations and regressions are really functionalist. Does it, and that's okay, but it'd really be good to see its origins. So how far back this goes, when did it, what keeps it going, but really because we know very little about norms. If we even think about why people don't litter, it's got nothing to do with laws. I mean, it's so simple to litter. I mean, my wife and I took a drive yesterday, went out for a hike, and I brought it up. I said, I was thinking about norms and how simple it'd be to litter.
Yep.
There's not a car in sight if you wanted to throw your wrapper out. So it's really a social norm that we have, and we look at people when they do litter and so on. But it's a belief mechanism. And I think that's what's going on here. It's that this is the right thing to do under these circumstances. and it's condoned by the community I live in. But it's also, I find it really fascinating, and I'd like to see you expand that section or get your response to why this is a group activity. They don't come in and shoot them. They tend to hack them up and make a performance out of it.
Right. And I think that's actually kind of I'm puzzling, but my hunch is that's the key to its persistence, right? Is that it's not an execution, right? Because that would or it is an execution, but there is no single executioner.
Right. Yeah.
Precisely because that would mean putting the weight of authority for this action on a single person, right? Rather than dispersing it amongst the community.
Yeah.
Right.
And vigilante groups were that way too. They were groups that would go after cattle rustlers and others. So I think that's really an important part of this dynamic, but also from a policies perspective, it's very difficult to change norms.
Right.
Because they're not simply laws or rules made by the state. They're outside of the state. And that I think, so if you could, to the extent you can, I mean, how long has this been going on in Haiti? And, on a controlled experiment, it'd be nice to see, well, gee, Dominican Republic is right next door. Do they also have social justice? Just kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, what as part of kind of the exercise in figuring out how unique is this to Haiti, we've been going through the human rights or State Department reports, and a lot of the descriptions, right? We don't have kind of the data in the same way, but a lot of the descriptions about the methods and the justification are very, very similar, right? So it does seem like this is very much not Haiti specific, but that could kind of help us get a
We
purchase
talked about
on.
Brazil.
Yeah.
That's right.
Brazil and South Africa appear to be
Yeah.
kind of similarly extremely common.
Sorry, I was taking notes. Angie, you're next.
So when I read this, I can't help but wonder how much external events impact this stuff, that what you're talking, the legitimacy. And I mention that because you are talking about an area of the world that has been decimated multiple times, and you recognize the earthquake in here, and so I don't know. So this is slightly outside my area. So I just had this moment where I thought, well, how much does this have to do with these sort of every 10-year natural disasters and the placement of hurricanes and Dean, how much does that impact the ability of the government to take on more than just day-to-day, oh dear Lord, there's nothing left, and it causes them to focus less on certain things and more on day-to-day stuff. And I think maybe, and the reason I think of it is because in the United States we have similar events, these natural disasters that occur, that we do end up with vigilante justice for a period of time where the state literally announces, we're out of here, good luck. If you're staying, good luck. And there are literally legitimate, the hurricane that just happened in Florida, they call it the Cajun Mafia. If you've ever been down through something like this, they're wonderful people, but a few of them are just a bit nuts. And they are absolutely vigilantes as well as helpers. And so part of me wants, when I was reading this, just wants to tie in. And again, neither of those are actually my areas. So jump in for people who do more of the natural disaster, climate change, all that type of stuff. But when you only look at one particular area, I think you either have to dismiss that as part of what's happening, is that the community is just smashed. Now we've got to figure out where people can live in water, and I'm sorry, we don't have time to mount a police force because our police force doesn't have a place to live. Versus sustaining a community for a period of time, and now they still fail to embrace legitimacy. Does that make sense? And I don't know that's right, please understand, but I do think when I was reading it, I thought of that because Haiti is so recent in in most of our memories of a place that has just been decimated, Puerto Rico. But then we have places in the United States as well, Florida and New Orleans. I mean, and to me they're somewhat similar. Although, and I know people are going to say this didn't happen in New Orleans after Katrina, but it did. So, it did. So it's an interesting comparison and contrasting of, is it that a moment, or is it now you have had plenty of time to recover from the moment, and you still fail to embrace that legitimacy?
Right. Well, and this is something that we might be able to get a little more purchase on in terms of we have respondents kind of earthquake effectiveness,
Right.
both.
I saw you
Yeah.
talked about it. Yeah.
Self-reported as well as some more objective measures. So that may kind of help us tie down a bit more of a causal story. What would be kind of fascinating, I think you're alluding to, is what happens if there's a moment in which kind of a link that is nascent or non-existent just like gets between the state and these communities gets broken. Something like this emerges, and then it becomes very sticky, right? To undo, right? And perpetuates itself,
Right.
And that could be war, or it could be a disaster.
Especially people that stay through the disaster.
Right.
They are a unique breed sometimes of people who have just a different view on life and a different disenfranchisement. You end up, New Orleans is different today than it was pre-Katrina, and it was substantially different 6 months after Katrina than it was prior to Katrina. And there was a state and there was these awful occurrences of communities just walking around being their own neighborhood watch, which were not nice and were not what we would ever want to hope, but they were legitimate as legitimate could be at the time.
But this idea, I think we have a bit more purchase on data.
Just real fast.
Sure.
So I think just to counter that, my view is this has been going on in Haiti for a very, very long time. And here's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Slavery, the harshest treatment of slaves in the world, hands down, was Haiti. I mean, the slaves themselves were practicing infanticide because they didn't want to bring up children in that environment. And if you read about the slave revolt, they went around hacking up white people as soon as they got control. So I think you have this history of violence going back to slavery and then freedom that carried over, that this is how we deal with stuff. So that's not an answer. It's just saying I think it's been this history of violence goes back to Haiti for a very long time, and it's understanding that dynamic of why Haiti could never really get control. And I think these disasters just add fuel to that fire, as opposed to causing the fire to just burn out. So it could be it sustains it, but I think it was probably always going on.
Yeah. But we might think about where this plays out in other very difficult to govern spaces, right?
Yeah.
Like Afghanistan and
Right.
Catherine's point too.
Susie and Bob, you both have points, but you're both a lunch crowd. So if you want to just say your point quickly, and then we can follow. You guys can follow up with lunch.
I'll wait for lunch.
All right, Susie, you want to go?
My point was minor. I think your second section, you should ditch it or condense it and put it in the intro, because it doesn't really test your theory at all. And it might just be a better use of motivating the so what, motivating the puzzle, and saying, hey, this phenomenon exists globally. Let's study it.
Going to the previous discussion about natural disasters, experiencing disasters might lead people to further prime the presence of this functioning state or a rebel group. So they might be even further than the theoretical framework, the average level, to engage in these violent acts as a demonstrating effect, because they associate lack of state with their experiences in this disaster environments. So,
yeah, I think this built on the comments from before, right? That prior experiences where you've kind of collectively figured out a way to solve this problem might make it kind of easier to revert to, right? Or to sustain in these moments of crisis.
Isn't Haiti's geographically located? So now you're really testing me. I can point to it on a map, but isn't Haiti geographically located in a way that it was a massive part of the sugar trade? So you had constant. I mean, they're of one place you could point, one of a few places I guess you could point to on the globe. It is one place that was constantly part of conflict, regardless of, and then you dump disasters on it, and the French bugger off, and in come the Brits, and then they take on the island themselves, correct?
Right, so they have
Yeah.
this really special history of like the successful slave
Right.
revolt.
Yeah.
And we've got just 2 minutes left, so if you want to have some wrap-up comments or.
No, thank you everyone, this was incredibly helpful, especially for this kind of, the process, like lots of kind of grist, both theoretical and empirical to help us forward, so that's, just phenomenally helpful, so thank you so much.
Look forward to reading the book.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you.